Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Today we're tackling an incredibly tough question, one that's urgent and complex. What's life going to look like for Gaza's 2 million residents when the fighting eventually stops? And, maybe even more crucial, what are the factors simmering beneath the surface that could really reshape that future in ways we aren't anticipating? We've been digging into a recent piece from The Economist which, frankly, paints a very stark picture. It suggests Gaza will be at the mercy of outsiders for years to come. It talks about widespread hunger, government collapse, total economic ruin.
It does, and the article lays out some powerful, sobering facts about the humanitarian crisis. Those numbers, they really do stand up to scrutiny. The scale of the collapse is immense. But, as we get into this, I think we also need to look at some critical elements, maybe some different angles that the article doesn't fully explore or perhaps assumes, and understanding those is, I think, vital for getting the complete picture.
Okay, so let's try to navigate this together. We want clarity, obviously, but also a critical eye. Let's get beyond those headlines and really try to understand the forces at play here. First off, we have to acknowledge just how dire the situation is, as described in the article. The core claims it makes about the humanitarian crisis, they're backed up by solid, recent data. It's devastating. Take food, for instance, just the lack of it. The UN's World Food Program, the WFP, they estimate Gaza needs something like 62,000 tons of food every month. But, get this, over 5 months leading up to July, Israel allowed in an average of just under 20,000 tons per month.
Yeah, that's only about 32% of the bare minimum requirement. It's a huge deficit, a life-threatening one, really. And that sets the stage for, well, everything else.
And even when that trickle of aid gets in, distribution.
Oh, distribution is an absolute nightmare. You look at the UNOCA logs from June, they show this extreme rate of convoy attrition. It's quite shocking. Something like 88% of the UN trucks, that's over 1,000 trucks, were intercepted, or the aid was self-distributed before it even got to the warehouses it was meant for.
Wow, 88%.
Yeah. So it's not just about the volume coming in, it's a massive delivery crisis inside Gaza itself. The food just isn't reaching the people who desperately need it.
And the direct result of that blockade, that diversion, is what? A black market?
Exactly. Prices have just exploded. Basic survival becomes a luxury most Gazans simply can't afford. Think about a 25-kilo sack of flour. Pre-war, maybe 35 shekels, about $10. Now, 625 shekels. That's over $160.
Unbelievable.
And tomatoes, 100 shekels a kilo. That's around 50 times what they cost before the war. For many people, the cost of, say, a single potato could be more than a day's wages, assuming they even have any income left.
So, with conditions that desperate, what's the real tangible impact on people? Especially the most vulnerable, like children.
Well, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, they reported over 20,000 children were admitted for acute malnutrition just between April and mid-July. And in places like Khan Yunis, the rates actually doubled. We're firmly in the emergency classification there. It's a catastrophic nutritional crisis unfolding right now.
And beyond hunger, the physical destruction. It's on another level entirely, isn't it?
It really is. UNOCIT did a debris scan back in April. They estimated 53 million tons of rubble.
53 million. How did that compare?
Well, to put it in perspective, that's over 30 times the debris from Ground Zero in Manhattan after 9/11. After the 2014 Gaza war, there were maybe 2.5 million tons, and clearing that took 2 years. This scale is just immense. It's going to define the landscape for years.
And that physical and humanitarian toll must translate into a kind of despair, a desire to leave.
It does. You see it in polling. The Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, PCPSR, found in May that 43% of Gazans say they're willing to emigrate once the conflict ends. That willingness, despite incredibly deep ties to their land, it just underscores how dire things are, how little hope many see for a viable future inside Gaza right now.
Okay, so that's the grim picture painted by the data, the facts on the ground. Let's pivot slightly now and critically examine some of the framing in The Economist's analysis. Because while those facts are stark, undeniable, maybe the way the article frames things oversimplifies some dynamics or overlooks certain key elements.
I think that's fair. One crucial detail that often gets missed, or at least downplayed. The article focuses heavily on Israeli aid quotas, and rightly so, that's a major factor. But it makes the security vacuum inside Gaza almost invisible.
What do you mean by security vacuum?
Well, armed factions, including Hamas, they account for a large share of those convoy interceptions we talked about, the 88% figure. So without decent security on the ground, You could increase the number of trucks going in, but it won't actually solve the distribution problem if the aid gets looted immediately.
Right, so aid enters but gets diverted. It doesn't reach hungry people.
Precisely.
And there's another piece here that doesn't get much scrutiny, does it? Egypt's role.
That's a really important point. The Rafah crossing, it remains effectively shut for bulk aid. That means Cairo holds a pretty significant veto over aid volumes too, but you don't see that examined with the same intensity as Israel's role in the article. It's a key part of the equation.
So with these major bottlenecks at the known crossings, are there really no other ways to get aid in? Does the article explore alternatives?
It doesn't really highlight them fully. There are some emerging alternative corridors, like the Sea Pilot project from Cyprus to Gaza, and there's been a UAE-US air bridge effort. Now, granted, they've only delivered a few thousand tons so far at small scale, but they do show that Gaza isn't entirely hostage, logistically speaking, to just those two Israeli road crossings. There are other, albeit nascent, possibilities.
Okay, and what about the economic picture before the war? The article implies a collapse from relative self-sufficiency, but is that accurate?
That idea of pre-war self-sufficiency is, well, it's quite overstated. Even back in 2022, Gaza was importing up to 70% of its animal protein. Over half its wheat and feed grain came via Israel. The baseline reality was already deeply dependent on external supply lines, on aid. It wasn't some robust, self-sustaining economy that just suddenly collapsed. Its foundations were always quite fragile and externally linked.
That's important context. And thinking about rebuilding the rubble, the article suggests decades of work.
Yeah, and that timeline needs some unpacking. It's not purely an engineering problem. You have commercial outfits like UAE-based Trojan, these debris recycling consortia. They have the capacity, the technology to crush maybe 1 million tons of rubble a month. If the border's open and security's there, that could potentially turn decades of clearance into something more like 5 years.
So it's about political access, not just bulldozers.
Exactly. Political decisions, security frameworks, that's what dictates the timeline. Much more than just the physical capacity to move debris. The tech exists, the permissions don't.
And that links directly to money for rebuilding, doesn't it? Donor funds.
Absolutely. The UN has tracked about $15 billion in unspent pledges from previous Gaza conflicts. Money that was promised but never actually used. Why? Well, it gets stalled by things like Hamas imposing taxes, Israeli restrictions on dual-use materials like cement.
Things that could be used for tunnels or weapons as well as rebuilding.
Right. And also just persistent disputes between Palestinian factions. So unless there's a completely new security setup and a new governance agreement, any fresh money pledged now could just freeze up again. It's not just about getting new pledges. It's about creating conditions where existing and future funds can actually be spent effectively.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper now into some of the core assumptions the Economist piece seems to make. Challenging these might really shift how we think about Gaza's future.
Yeah, let's do that.
The article sort of implies this direct cause and effect. Israel restricts aid to hurt Hamas, and the result is famine. Simple as that. And while the volume restriction is definitely true and critical, there's that nuance we discussed. Maybe 9 out of 10 UN trucks in June were looted inside Gaza.
Right, so volume is essential. You can't get around that. But a secure corridor, whether it's run by multinationals or maybe Arab states, that seems to be a prerequisite. It's what's needed to actually translate tons of aid arriving at the border into calories reaching hungry families. Sending aid that just gets stolen doesn't solve the problem.
Okay, what about the long-term impact on children? The article mentions unavoidable lifelong damage from malnutrition. Is that inevitable?
Well, unavoidable is a strong word. If you look at historical examples like the Dutch hunger winter during World War II or famine periods in China in the 60s, studies from those times show that significant catch-up, both physically and cognitively, is possible. But it depends on nutrition and schooling rebounding quickly. So the next, say, 24 months are absolutely critical. It's not necessarily destiny. Rapid, effective intervention could mitigate a lot of that long-term damage.
That's a more hopeful perspective if the right conditions are met. And similarly, that rubble removal could take decades, claim.
Again, it needs context. With proper cross-border access, international coordination, the right heavy equipment, a 4 to 5 year program is technically feasible. It's ambitious, but feasible, without that access and coordination. Yeah, even 30 years might be optimistic. So the pace really hinges on political clearance, international cooperation, and security, not just the sheer volume of debris or the number of available machines.
The engineering is solvable, the politics aren't yet.
That's a good way to put it. And maybe the biggest underlying assumption we need to question is that phrase, outsider mercy is Gaza's only future, pure dependency. But if you connect this to the wider region, you see Gulf sovereign wealth funds, think Saudi Arabia's PIF, Qatar's QIA, Abu Dhabi's ADQ. They've actually commissioned feasibility studies, studies for things like ports and power infrastructure in Gaza. Now, crucially, these are conditional on post-Hamas governance.
So not just charity, but potential investment.
Potentially, yes. It's a very tentative path, obviously fraught with risk, but it does suggest a possible future driven by potential financial return, not solely humanitarian aid. It hints that if the right conditions for stability and governance emerge, strategic capital might flow in.
So pulling this all together, what does it mean for Gaza's actual path forward? The article is powerful on the scale of the collapse. It's undeniable, heartbreakingly accurate, but it seems to leave some really big strategic questions unanswered. And maybe those variables are the real game changers, more so than just counting aid trucks day to day.
I think that's right. First, the absolutely critical question: who guarantees security for aid distribution inside Gaza? We keep coming back to this looting issue. There was that leaked UN Arab plan floating around proposing maybe a 6,000-strong multinational force to guard crossings, warehouses. Without something like that, actual boots on the ground with a clear mandate, aid volume targets are almost beside the point. It's the fundamental missing piece right now.
And then there's the border politics, the anxieties of Egypt and Israel.
Exactly. It's incredibly complex. Egypt is terrified of a mass, permanent displacement of Gazans onto its territory. They see it as a major national security risk. Israel, meanwhile, is focused on preventing Hamas from rearming and stopping future attacks. Any long-term arrangement for border access has to credibly address both of those deep-seated fears. It's not just logistics, it's high-stakes geopolitics.
So access requires dealing with those core security concerns. And what about governance? Who actually runs things, manages the money?
That's the other huge question. What's the governance tiebreaker? You hear different ideas floated. Maybe an EU-managed trust fund to handle aid money transparently, keep it tax-free, or perhaps a municipal authority for Gaza that operates under a broader West Bank unity government. The point is, the faster some kind of credible, trusted custodian for governance can be established, the sooner those Gulf and Western investors we mentioned might actually consider, opening their checkbooks. Money needs stability and accountability.
Right. Investment follows governance. And finally, there's the human element, jobs versus emigration.
Yes. Before this war, you had over 110,000 Gazans working in Israel. That was a vital economic lifeline, injecting cash directly into households. If work permits could be gradually reopened, even partially, that could potentially inject something like $1 billion a year directly into Gazan household incomes. That's a powerful alternative to just assuming large-scale immigration is the only option. And polling suggests many Gazans, despite everything, would still prefer to stay and rebuild if they had economic prospects.
So offering a path to economic recovery through work rather than just aid or displacement.
Exactly. It empowers people directly.
Okay, so wrapping this up, as we've explored, the Economist article, it's persuasive, absolutely, on the sheer scale of the humanitarian disaster. And it's correct. Gaza cannot rebuild without significant outside help. That much is clear.
But if you look at the bigger picture, it kind of glosses over the fact that the nature of that help isn't predetermined. It's not fixed. If, and again, it's a significant if a serious deal on security and governance can actually materialize, then things like aid logistics, capital investment, even clearing the rubble, they could happen much faster, much more effectively than that initial bleak picture suggests.
But the flip side is also true. Without that kind of comprehensive deal,
Then yeah, just focusing on truck counts or those small C corridors, they'll remain temporary fixes, stopgaps. They might end up feeding the black market more than they feed hungry families or genuinely rebuild a functional society.
so it seems Gaza's future hinges less on the number of lorries allowed through tomorrow.
And much more on who controls the roads inside Gaza, who manages the money transparently, and who actually enforces the rules once the shooting finally stops. Those are the fundamental questions.
An incredibly complex situation, so many interwoven factors, so many potential paths, some very grim, others perhaps holding a sliver of hope depending on these big political and security decisions. As you reflect on our conversation today, maybe consider this. What single factor do you believe holds the most power to really alter Gaza's trajectory in the crucial years ahead? Thank you for joining us for this conversation.